Time for Little House on the Prairie again. Chapter 5, our last lesson for this week. It is called The House on the Prairie. So, make sure you have this, your pencil of course, and your vocab sheet. We're going to be working on the word providential. Last one on chapter 1. You have chapter 2 over here. Chapter 1, providential. Or week 1, not chapter 1. And then we're going to be working on sequencing. We're going to be talking about summarizing the beginning, the middle, and the end of the chapter. A summary, of course, is a short description of a chapter or a story that you have read, and it contains just the very big events. As I always say, those things that if we didn't write them down, we couldn't tell the rest of the chapter story. So, most summaries contain 3 main idea sentences. The most important thing from the beginning, the most important thing from the middle, and the most important thing from the end of the chapter. We'll write those together, and then you're going to come up with a summary paragraph on your own that you will share with me later. So the house on the prairie sounds like, to me, they are going to decide where they are going to live, and they're going to start building their house. So let's see how this goes. Oh, it's a good book and a good chapter. I think every chapter is a good chapter. I think I say that every time. And I will as we keep going. All right. Laura and Mary were up next morning earlier than the sun. They ate their breakfast of cornmeal mush with prairie hen gravy. Cornmeal mush is cornmeal made into kind of like an oatmeal consistency, and then kind of fried a little bit. I don't know how that would taste. And then gravy that was made from frying up the prairie hen the night before, was similar to chicken, so a chicken type gravy. And hurried to help Ma wash the dishes. Pa was loading everything else into the wagon and hitching up Pet and Patty. When the sun rose, they were driving on across the prairie. There was no road now. Pet and Patty waded through the grasses because at that time the prairie hadn't been plowed up at all, or even used or built on, and the prairie grasses were anywhere from 3 feet tall to 6 feet tall. Think about a yardstick or 2 yardsticks. So if animals went through them, they had to kind of wade through, and they would kind of plop down those grasses, and some would stay broken over and some would pop back up when they got through them, but it would have been slow going. And the wagons left behind it only the tracks of its wheels. Before noon, Pa said, "Whoa!" The wagon stopped. "Here we are, Caroline," he said. "Right here we'll build our house." Laura and Mary scrambled over the feed box and dropped to the ground in a hurry. All around them was nothing but grassy prairie spreading to the edge of the sky. Quite near them, to the north, the creek bottoms lay below the prairie. Some darker green treetops showed, and beyond them bits of the rim of earthen bluffs held up the prairie's grasses. Far away to the east, a broken line of different greens lay on the prairie, and Pa said that was the river. "That's the Verdigris River," he said, pointing it out to Ma. Right away, he and Ma began to unload the wagon. They took out everything and piled it on the ground. Then they took off the wagon cover and put it over the pile. Then they took even the wagon box off, while Laura and Mary and Jack watched. The wagon had been home for a long time. Now there was nothing left of it but the 4 wheels and the part that connected them. Pet and Patty were still hitched to the tongue. Pa took a bucket and his axe, and sitting on this skeleton wagon, he drove away. Can you imagine? So all it was like 4 wheels, and then the axles that held them together, and then one line of wood running down the middle. It would have been hard to drive, and I can't imagine driving that loaded with logs. Where's Pa going? Laura asked, and Ma said he's going to get a load of logs from the creek bottoms. It was strange and frightening to be left without the wagon on the high prairie. The land and the sky seemed too large, and Laura felt small. She wanted to hide and be still in the tall grass, like a little prairie chicken. But she didn't. She helped Ma, and while Mary sat on the grass and minded baby Carrie. First, Laura and Mary made the beds under the wagon-covered tent. Then Ma arranged the boxes and bundles while Laura pulled all the grass from a space in front of the tent. That made a bare place for the fire. They couldn't start the fire until Pa brought wood. There was nothing more to do, so Laura explored a little. She did not go far from the tent, but she found a queer little kind of tunnel in the grass. You'd never notice it if you looked across the waving grass tops, but when you came to it, there it was, a narrow, straight, hard path down the grass stems. It went out into the endless prairie. Laura went along it a little way. She went slowly and more slowly, and then she stood still and felt queer. So she turned around and came back quickly. When she looked over her shoulder, there wasn't anything there, but she hurried. You ever had that feeling where something's watching you, or you just get kind of scared? When Pa came riding back up on the load of logs, Laura told him about that path. He said he had seen it yesterday. It's some old trail, he said. That night by the fire, Laura asked again when she would see a papoose. But Pa didn't know. He said you never saw Indians unless they wanted you to see them. He had seen Indians when he was a boy in New York State, but Laura never had. She knew they were wild men with red skins, and their hatchets were called tomahawks. Pa knew all about wild animals, so he must know about wild men, too. Laura thought he would show her a papoose someday, just as he had shown her fawns and little bears and wolves. For days, Pa hauled logs. He made 2 piles of them, one for the house and one for the stable. There began to be a road where he drove back and forth to the creek bottoms. And at night, on their picket lines, Pet and Patty ate the grass till it was short and stubby all around the log piles. Pa began the house first. He paced off the sides of it on the ground. Then with his spade, he dug a shallow little hole along 2 sides of the space. You can't see it there, but you can see the wood down inside of it. Into these hollows he rolled 2 of the biggest logs. They were sound, strong logs because they must hold up the house. They were called sills. Then Pa chose 2 more strong, big logs, and he rolled these logs onto the ends of the sills so that they made a hollow square. Now with his axe, he cut a wide, deep notch near each end of these logs, and that's what he's doing in the picture. He cut these notches out of the top of the log, but with his eye he measured the sills, and he cut the notches so that they would fit around half of the sill. So when the notches were cut, he rolled the log over, and the notches fitted down over the sill. And that finished the foundation of the house. And you see how they lay right together and go all the way to the ground. If you have Lincoln logs, you can get out and kind of build with those and see how it works. It was 1 log high. The sills were still buried in the ground, and the logs on their ends fitted snugly to the ground. At the corners where they crossed, the notches let them fit together so that they were no thicker than 1 log, and the 2 ends stuck out beyond the notches. Next day, Pa began the walls. From each side he rolled up a log, and he notched its end so that it fitted down over the end logs. Then he rolled up logs from the ends and notched them so that they fitted down over the side logs. Now the whole house was 2 logs high. The logs fitted solidly together at the corners, but no log is ever perfectly straight, and all logs are bigger at one end than at the other end. So cracks were left between them all along the walls. But that did not matter because Pa would chink those cracks. Chinking was to take mud and you filled in the cracks where the logs were different sizes, and it would dry in there and keep your house mostly waterproof. You had to do it again from time to time because it would dry up completely and it would fall out, and then you'd have holes again. So it was an every year thing you had to do, was to re-chink your house. All by himself he built the house 3 logs high. Then Ma helped him. Pa lifted one end of a log onto the wall, then Ma lifted it while he lifted the other end. He stood up on the wall to cut the notches, and Ma helped roll and hold the log while he settled it where it should be to make the corner perfectly square. So log by log they built the house's walls higher till they were pretty high, and Laura couldn't get over them anymore. She was tired of watching Pa and Ma build the house, and she went into the tall grass exploring. Suddenly she heard Pa shout, "Let go! Get out from under!" The big heavy log was sliding. Pa was trying to hold up his end of it to keep it from falling on Ma. He couldn't. It crashed down, and Ma huddled on the ground. She got to Ma almost as quickly as Pa did. Pa knelt down and called Ma in a dreadful voice, and Ma gasped, "I'm all right." The log was on her foot. Pa lifted the log, and Ma pulled her foot out from under it. Pa felt to see if any bones were broken. "Move your arms," he said. "Is your back hurt? Can you turn your head?" Ma moved her arms and turned her head. "Oh, thank God," Pa said. He helped Ma to sit up. She said again, "I'm all right, Charles. It's just my foot." Quickly Pa took off her shoe and stocking. He felt her foot all over, moving the ankle and the instep and every toe. "Does it hurt much?" he asked. Oh my goodness. It's amazing her foot's not broken, isn't it? Ma's face was gray and her mouth was a tight line. "Not much," she said. "Well, no bones broken," said Pa. "It's only a bad sprain." Ma said cheerfully, "Well, a sprain soon mended. Don't be so upset, Charles." "I blame myself," said Pa. "I should have used skids." He helped Ma to the tent. He built up the fire and heated water. When the water was as hot as Ma could bear, she put her swollen foot in it. It was providential, there's our word, that the foot was not crushed. Only a little hollow in the ground had saved it. That's almost, I guess, a miracle? Pa kept pouring more hot water into the tub in which Ma's foot was soaking. Her foot was red from the heat, and the puffed ankle began to turn purple. Ma took her foot out of the water and bound strips of rag tightly around and around the ankle. "I can manage," she said. She could not get her shoe on, but she tied more rags around her foot, and she hobbled on it. She got supper as usual, only a little more slowly. But Pa said she could not help to build the house until her ankle was well. He hewed out skids. These were long, flat slabs. One end rested on the ground, and the other end rested on the log wall. He was not going to lift any more logs. So skids are like ramps that you roll things up. He and Ma would roll them up the skids, but Ma's ankle was not well yet. When she unwrapped it in the evenings to soak it in hot water, it was all purple and black and green and yellow. The house must wait. Then one afternoon, Pa came merrily whistling up the creek road. They had not expected him home from hunting so soon. As soon as he saw them, he shouted, "Good news!" They had a neighbor, only 2 miles away on the other side of the creek. Pa had met him in the woods. They were going to trade work, and that would make it easier for everyone. "He's a bachelor," said Pa, "and he says he can get along without a house better than you and the girls can. So he's going to help me first. Then as soon as he gets his logs ready, I'll go over and help him." They need not wait any longer for the house, and Ma need not do any more work on it. That's good. "How do you like that, Caroline?" Pa asked joyfully, and Ma said, "That's good, Charles. I'm glad." Early the next morning, Mr. Edwards came. He was lean and tall and brown. He bowed to Ma and called her ma'am politely, but he told Laura that he was a wildcat from Tennessee. He wore tall boots and a ragged jumper. A jumper is a sweater. And a coonskin cap, and he could spit tobacco juice farther than Laura had ever imagined that anyone could spit tobacco juice. He could hit anything he spit at, too. Laura tried and tried, but she could never spit so far or so well as Mr. Edwards could. He was a fast worker. In one day, he and Pa built those walls as high as Pa wanted them. They joked and sang while they worked, and their axes made the chips fly. On top of the walls, they set up a skeleton roof of slender poles. Then in the south wall, they cut a tall hole for a door, and in the west wall and the east wall, they cut square holes for the windows. Laura couldn't wait to see the inside of the house. As soon as the tall hole was cut, she ran inside. Everything was striped there. Stripes of sunshine came through the cracks in the west wall, and stripes of shadow came down from the poles overhead. The stripes of shade and sunshine were all across Laura's hands and her arms and her bare feet. And through the cracks between the logs she could see stripes of prairie. The sweet smell of the prairie mixed with the sweet smell of cut wood. Then as Pa cut away the logs to make the window hole in the west wall, chunks of sunshine came in. When he finished, a big block of sunshine lay on the ground inside the house. Around the door hole and the window holes, Pa and Mr. Edwards nailed thin slabs against the cut ends of the logs, and the house was finished, all but the roof. The walls were solid and the house was large, much larger than the tent. It was a nice house. Mr. Edwards said he would go home now, but Pa and Ma said he must stay to supper. Ma had cooked an especially good supper because they had company. There was stewed jackrabbit with white flour dumplings and plenty of gravy. There was a steaming hot, thick cornbread flavored with bacon fat, real cornbread. There was molasses to eat on the cornbread, but because this was a company supper, they did not sweeten their coffee with molasses. Ma brought out the little paper sack of pale brown store sugar. Mr. Edwards said he surely did appreciate that supper. Then Pa brought out his fiddle. Mr. Edwards stretched out on the ground to listen. But first Pa played for Mary and Laura. He played their favorite song and he sang it. Laura liked it best of all because Pa's voice went down deep, deep, deeper in that song. Oh, I am a gypsy king, I come and go as I please. I pull my old nightcap down and take the world at my ease. Then his voice went down deep, deep, down, deeper than the very oldest bullfrogs. Oh, I am a gypsy king. They all laughed. Laura could hardly stop laughing. Oh, sing it again, Pa, sing it again, she cried, before she remembered that children must be seen and not heard, and then she was quiet. Pa went on playing, and everything began to dance. Mr. Edwards rose up on one elbow, then he sat up, then he jumped up, and he danced. He danced like a jumping jack in the moonlight, while Pa's fiddle kept on rollicking, and his foot kept tapping the ground, and Laura's hands and Mary's hands were clapping together, and their feet were patting too. You're the fiddlingest fool that I ever see. And you can see their cabin there. And that's Mr. Edwards. He's kind of funny looking. Mr. Edwards shouted admiringly to Pa. He didn't stop, it's a long chapter, dancing. Pa didn't stop playing. He played Money Musk, An Arkansas Traveler, Irish Washerwoman, and Devil's Hornpipe. Baby Carrie couldn't sleep in all that music. She sat up in Ma's lap looking at Mr. Edwards with round eyes and clapping her little hands and laughing. Even the firelight danced, and all around its edge the shadows were dancing. Only the new house stood still and quiet in the dark till the big moon rose and shone on its gray walls and the yellow chips around it. Mr. Edwards said he must go. It was a long way back to his camp on the other side of the woods and the creek. He took his gun and said good night to Laura and Mary and Ma. He said a bachelor got mighty lonesome, and he surely had enjoyed this evening of home life. Play, Ingalls, he said. Play me down the road. So while he went down the creek road and out of sight, Pa played, and Pa and Mr. Edwards and Laura sang with all their might. Old Dan Tucker was a fine old man. He washed his face in the frying pan. He combed his hair with the wagon wheel and died of a toothache in his heel. Get out of the way for old Dan Tucker. He's too late to get his supper. Supper's over and the dishes washed. Nothing left but a piece of squash. Old Dan Tucker went to town, riding a mule, leading a hound. Far over the prairie rang Pa's big voice and Laura's little one, and faintly from the creek bottoms came a last whoop from Mr. Edwards. Get out of the way for old Dan Tucker. He's too late to get his supper. When Pa's fiddle stopped, they could not hear Mr. Edwards any more. Only the wind rustled in the prairie grasses. The big yellow moon was sailing high overhead. The sky was so full of light that not one star twinkled in it, and all the prairie was a shadowy mellowness. Then from the woods by the creek a nightingale began to sing. Everything was silent, listening to the nightingale's song. The birds sang on and on. The cool wind moved over the prairie, and the song was round and clear above the grasses, whispering. The sky was like a bowl of light overturned on the flat black land. The song ended. No one moved or spoke. Laura and Mary were quiet. Pa and Ma sat motionless. Only the wind stirred and the grasses sighed. Then Pa lifted the fiddle to his shoulder and softly touched the bow to the string. A few notes fell like clear drops of water into the stillness. A pause, and Pa began to play the nightingale's song. The nightingale answered him. The nightingale began to sing again. It was singing with Pa's fiddle. When the strings were silent, the nightingale went on singing. When it paused, the fiddle called to it, and it sang again. The bird and the fiddle were talking to each other in the cool night under the moon. And we're going to end there. Okay, so our word was providential. So get your paper, and on the back of it, you're going to want to write down what providential means. So providential was used in our chapter when they were talking about Ma's ankle. The great big log rolled down and landed right on her foot, and somehow it didn't wind up being broken. They found out that there was a little hollow in the ground, and her foot was down in that, and the board came down and didn't actually hit all of her ankle since it was lower than that into the ground. So they said that was providential. Providence is often a word used in old times to talk about heaven. So providential in this case, you're probably thinking, wow, what a miracle. That's something we would say today. And that's what they would say back in Laura's time when things seemed miraculous. So providential means miraculous. Let me write that word down for you. Miraculous. So we want to write that. Miraculous for providential. All right, everybody have that written down. If not, you can pause the video and come back and write it down, and then catch back up. But I'm going to move on. So we're going to do some summarizing. We're going to write what we felt was the most important thing at the beginning of the chapter. And remember, we're not writing full sentences. We're just writing down phrases or a phrase that tell what they were doing. You will make that into your own sentences later. So at the beginning of the chapter, obviously the most important thing is that they moved into their new, I guess we'll have to say land. They would have called it a homestead. They didn't have a home built on it yet, but that was going to be their land. So I'm going to say they arrived on their land. Okay, so we're going to write that in the beginning box. They arrived on their land. All right, pause it if you're not done. Then for the middle of the chapter, well, that was probably the most exciting thing of the chapter happened in the middle. Ma got hurt. Helping Pa build the house. Because building the house is also important. need to write that down. Ma got hurt helping Pa build the house. All right, again, pause that if you need to. And then, of course, what happened at the end of the chapter? Mr. Edwards and Pa built the house, except for the roof and the door and the window covers, but they got most of it done. Mr. Edwards and Pa built the house. So those were the three most important things from the chapter. They arrived on their land. Pa and Ma started to build the house, but she got hurt. And then Pa met Mr. Edwards, and he came and helped him finish building the house. So you should have those three things written on your trifold in the beginning, middle, and end box. So now on your own, you need to write a summary at the bottom. You putting those into sentences, 3 lines. You can add some of your own words if you want to, and then you're going to read it to me on the response on the video. So that leaves one last thing before I go. Pa is an amazing musician, and he plays the violin, which they call the fiddle, which I know you've learned about with Mrs. Ligon. If we were at school, Mrs. Ligon would play you some prairie or some pioneer songs, and one she always plays so you can listen to what it really sounded like, and someone singing it is Old Dan Tucker. You can look that song up and Google and listen to it, or on any of your other music things that you listen to, and see what a pioneer song sounded like. That might be fun to do too. All right, see you next time.